Okay, part two. I had to make sure that my dog wasn't running into the street. Okay. Um, so this history of segregated schools, we know that it is not well known, not known by many people at all. And also, it really draws into question some of the assumptions that we made about Black people in schools during this time. I have another quote that I really like that I think demonstrates the quality of these schools again. And so this was taken from a study that was done on one of the first all African American schools in DC. And the researcher that was studying this school says that the most striking and important finding in the study is the synergism. That means the congruency, the working together among community, parents, administrators, teachers, and students of Dunbar. The next is that educational aspirations and attainment of young Blacks were not circumscribed by the educational attainment of their parents. And I'm going to give you this quote on our discussion board. But just to break it down, what that's saying is that one thing that was amazing about this school is that there was an interwovenness in the role of the school, the role of the community, the role of parents, and you've kind of read a little bit about that. But what was also really amazing about this school is these children who had parents who did not have this education, who did not have this opportunity that they had, and their future wasn't dictated by what their parents could do. And if you think about how special that is, we can't even say that about our schools now. Our schools now, we know that there's a big connection between a parent's educational attainment and a student's educational attainment. But in these segregated schools, they found a way to disrupt that. And that is worth studying and knowing more about. And if we had a whole nother semester, I would love to dive deeper into that. Stay tuned. Hopefully I will get a class one day where I can just talk about the history of Black education, where we can talk about how they did all of these things, because there is more to this story. And so that is why I believe that this is a really important part of the history to understand. And also, I want you to think now, and this is where our discussion is today, that not only has this part of the history of Black education, not only is it important to us, but what does it say about how education was formed for everyone? Like I mentioned before, that there was lots of things that didn't make sense going on, where, teachers that had more high qualifications were not being paid more, where just because a teacher was Black and they wanted to teach advanced chemistry or advanced physics or something, that they couldn't do it because another white school doesn't have that capability. Think about what that does to our culture as a whole, how we hold everyone back because we find it important to hold Black people back. That has a deep impact on our culture, and it's weird looking back now because we know how to code these things differently. But back then it was just very open, no, you can't do it because the white school can't do it. And it's important to not forget that was open, that was purposeful. A big theme of this class is so many of these things are purposeful, and we have to understand how that happens. I was laughing at one of your QCQs where you asked, so this is basically a history class? Yes, it's a history class, but more importantly, it's history that you weren't taught before, that has everything to do with the foundations of our educational system and how it works. In these next few weeks, you're going to really be making those connections. So back to our discussion for today, how it affects all of us. So Something I wanted to throw out there for our discussion. There is this professor of Africana Studies, African American Studies, called Dr. Naeem Akbar. And he has this theory that talks about a legacy of competence. And this theory says that if you know that your people have a history of being competent, if you know that your people have a history of being excellent in a certain area, then your own confidence can be improved. And how I apply this to this history of segregated schools is that if we had known that African American educators had this history of being excellent, specifically in creating, revolutionary Black students, like they did in the class of people who changed the world with the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. If we knew that they had this excellence in their history and excellence in how they did things, how would that have changed how we saw ourselves in schools? And so here's my question, and what I want you to answer in your posts is that, one, what was your assumption of the history of Black education prior to this? Like, if you ever thought about segregated schools and you knew like the general history of them, what did you think about it? What did that say to you about African American people? What other kind of assumptions did you have about African American students and parents and communities based on that? And then also answer, how do you think knowing this history, knowing that there's a history of excellence, a history of competence in Black educators and Black education, how would that have changed how you saw yourself? That's one question. Another question, and I want you to answer all of these, is how do you think that would change how others saw you? Like, if you imagine if your teacher, if you're anything like me, you probably had a lot of white teachers. How do you think your white teachers would have treated you differently or the same if they also knew about this history of competence, this history of excellence? And then another question I want you to answer is, imagine it for other people around you. Like, imagine it for other African American students that you've known in your life. What difference do you think that would make to them? I want to encourage you in your post to talk about some of your own experiences with thinking about what it means to be a Black person in school, if you identify as African American, thinking about what it means to, one, have an assumption of inferiority, where I know in my experience, I assumed that because I was African American, because of my experience, that there was something inferior in my experiences in schools. And that might not have been conscious to me, but it was definitely real. And so, like, if you can think about a time in your life when you were younger, when you were trying to figure out what it meant to be a Black person or be a person of color in school, and whether that meant a good thing to you or whether that meant a bad thing, and how that affected your own self-esteem and how you saw yourself. I hope that we can have a really good discussion on this, and feel free to also read other people's comments and comment on them. Anyway, I enjoyed this. I hope that this adds some more context for you as you are doing your reading for this week. And so for this week, I think you're doing some reading that is important, again, making this connection to how we got here, especially. So your readings for today, first you're going to be reading Paradoxes of Desegregation, which is a really, really good article to kind of talk about how Desegregation, which we pretty much, universally accept as a good thing. It was important to dismantle legalized segregation. But also there are lots of little and big repercussions of it. And so your reading for today is going to kind of talk about that. And so it's very, very good reading. Definitely read through. From there, you can also make some connections to add to your discussion for today, just about how does this connect with how you understand school, and how does maybe the history of desegregation relate to all of those assumptions that you had about Black education. So just as a recap, I want you to respond to the discussion questions just about the history of competence, and also connect it to the reading that you have for today. For Thursday, you have a choice between one article about Atlanta desegregation that I highly suggest because it shows this really complicated timeline of how desegregation played out in Atlanta. Just a little preview. So like Atlanta is often called like the city too busy to hate. And that's because like the dominant story is that, Atlanta desegregated their schools and everything was fine and everything was good and nothing bad happened. Where in the article you see how actually there's so much more that went into that, where when they say they desegregated schools, they put 9 students in a Black school, and all of those students had to pass all of these like personality interviews and academic interviews, and they set up all of these systems that were designed to make it easier for white people to leave a school if it was being desegregated, and set up all of these private schools. And so it kind of just shows the complexity of desegregation, and like the full title of it says From Segregation to Segregation, because it starts off in segregation, and even with all of the ups and downs of deseg, we ended up just as segregated as we were before. And so this is a good one to read if you want to really understand how we are still so very segregated. The second one is Forgotten Voices, and this one is written by Dr. Jerome Morris, who is a professor at UMSL, and he does research on the history of Black education in St. Louis. And so if you wanted a more like personalized experience kind of looking at Black education in St. Louis, and looking at the roles of Black educators in the various desegregation plans in St. Louis, this is a good one to read. You still have to do the QCQ due on Thursday. Anyway, I hope this helps, and I enjoyed this, and I hope that we get a really good discussion out of this. I think we will. Anyway, have a great day.